In this week's Artemis update, NASA is moving Artemis II hardware into place for upcoming stacking operations at the Kennedy Space Center. Last weekend, Exploration Ground Systems received the SLS second stage and staged the connector for that in the Vehicle Assembly Building for its upcoming lift. At the end of this week, EGS prepared for the next lift by laying the core stage back down on the floor of the VAB to get ready to stack it in the coming days. Hey everyone, thanks as always for your time. I'll dig into the details of where some of the Artemis II elements are right now and where they're going in the next 6 to 8 weeks. But we're still also waiting to hear what the President and Elon Musk are going to do to Artemis as a whole. Will they kill Artemis or won't they remains the big question of the year, and I'll review what we're waiting for next. For Orion and SLS, that could determine their future, but other programs like Starship have their own issues to deal with right now. At the end, I'll go into the details of the big picture as it stands, but let's start with the latest Artemis II activities. In the past week or so, we saw more visible signs of Artemis II vehicle assembly and preparations for the next steps in that assembly. At the end of last week, we saw the SLS second stage and its connector make their next moves ahead of stacking. On March 7th, the Launch Vehicle Stage Adapter, or LVSA, was rolled around the Vehicle Assembly Building from High Bay 4, where it was in storage, to the south entrance for the transfer aisle, which is where Exploration Ground Systems Integrated Operations is preparing Artemis II hardware for lifting into High Bay 3 for stacking on Mobile Launcher 1. This is a different convention than was used for Artemis I, where the LVSA was lifted into place directly from High Bay 4 when it was stacked in June 2021. The adapter connects the 8.4 meter wide SLS core stage with the 5.1 meter wide Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, or ICPS. The ICPS was the next element to move. On March 9th, it was transported from United Launch Alliance's Delta Operations Center on the Cape Canaveral side of the area to the Multi-Payload Processing Facility in the Kennedy Space Center Industrial Area. The NASA Causeway connects Cape Canaveral with the KSC Industrial Area, which includes the center's headquarters. However, ICPS had to take the long way around. Riding in the VTF, the Vertical Transport Fixture, ICPS was driven all the way up the coast to the Launch Pad 39B perimeter. So it got a quick tour of its future launch pad, and then the convoy continued alongside the crawlerway back to the Launch Complex 39 area and past the VAB, where it will return in perhaps only a few weeks. And then back south down the parkway to the Causeway, then to the industrial area, and then to the MPPF. NASA Kennedy Space Center Public Affairs posted images of a handover ceremony in the MPPF the next day on March 10th. Where prime contractor ULA transferred control of the ICPS to Exploration Ground Systems. The MPPF is where NASA performs hazardous fluid transfers for vehicles like spacecraft and ICPS. The ICPS uses liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen for its major propulsive translational maneuvers, but for attitude control maneuvering, it uses hydrazine, and those two tanks will be loaded in the MPPF in the next several days. After that, the stage will retrace part of the route it was taken just last weekend, first going to the VAB Transfer Aisle for stacking. The SLS in-space second stage will be the last near-term element lifted into High Bay 3. The SLS boosters were topped out in February, and core stage lifting operations are expected to begin in the next week to mate it to the boosters. Then the LVSA will be lifted on top of the core stage forward skirt, followed by ICPS stacking. That's still expected to be completed next month in April, at which point EGS Integrated Operations will work to plug those SLS elements together and plug the mobile launcher umbilicals into those elements. Once the stages and boosters are connected to the ground launch processing system, then integrated testing can begin, with power-up of the SLS flight computers, avionics, and ICPS computer systems. In the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building, Lockheed Martin continues assembly and test of the next 3 Orion spacecraft through the Artemis IV build. Right now, most of the attention is on the Artemis II spacecraft, which is nearing handover to EGS for launch processing. In early March, the solar array wings were installed on the Artemis II Orion spacecraft, and imagery taken after that work was completed was posted online during the week. Next up was encapsulation of the Orion service module for launch. The 3 spacecraft adapter jettison panels, or SAJ panels, which make up the service module fairing, were planned for installation over the last several days. Following those installs, the spacecraft should be moved back into the final assembly systems test cell for final crew module installs and other final work before Lockheed hands the spacecraft over to Exploration Ground Systems. On Friday, March 14th, Core Stage 2 was lifted out of Boeing's vertical integration cell in High Bay 2, rotated to horizontal, and placed back on its ground transportation carrier on the floor of the VAB Transfer Aisle. NASA Kennedy Space Center Public Affairs posted several shots of this first of 2 breakover operations on social media on Friday afternoon. NASA also published a blog post with a shot of the stage after it had been positioned in the MPTS carrier, which stands for Multipurpose Transportation System. In the shot, we can see the LVSA, Launch Vehicle Stage Adapter, in the background. The LVSA will be repositioned in the transfer aisle after the core stage has been lifted to clear the transfer aisle floor. SPMTs, self-propelled modular transporters, are used in this breakover operation to make fine adjustments to the carrier positioning while the 2 cranes hold the stage. In the coming days, the SPMTs will drive the stage north across the transfer aisle floor and under the heavy crane for high bays 3 and 4. There are 2 325-ton heavy cranes, one for high bays 1 and 2, and the other for high bays 3 and 4. There is also a 175-ton crane that traverses the transfer aisle and is used for both breakovers. That crane and the heavy crane for high bays 1 and 2 are in the process of being disconnected from the stage or already are. After the stage is rolled north under the other heavy crane, the second breakover operation will set up stacking the core stage with the SLS boosters. That will be something to watch for next week, along with more imagery of this first breakover operation and the second one. One additional thing from the picture included in the blog post is that it looks like the SLS program has made the decision to add Strakes to the core stage for this flight. One of the issues during part of the launch was a so-called vortex or ascent vibration issue. Back at the mid-December KSC media event I attended, I got a rare and simultaneously rushed opportunity to talk in person with NASA and Boeing SLS officials. At the event, NASA and Boeing talked about options they were still deliberating about to deal with the issue. One option was to add Strakes on either side of the forward booster to core stage attach points. The preparation work described for that option was to remove some foam from part of the exterior of the inner tank, and also that some match drilling would be necessary on the inside to bolt the Strakes into the structure. And that's what this work here looks like. The inner tank structure on the exterior includes intersecting ribs, which run longitudinally and also circumferentially. We can see 2 locations on either side of this booster attach fitting where the circumferential ribs of the structure are visible, and some very light colored foam runs in the pockets created by the intersecting ribs. I don't know what the Strakes look like, but they don't appear here. The obvious guess is that they will be installed later in the processing flow after the core is vertical again and mated to the boosters in High Bay 3. Late Friday the 14th or early Saturday the 15th, NASA published additional imagery of the core stage in the transfer aisle after this first of 2 breakovers, along with the LVSA behind it. We can see in all of the imagery posted yesterday that the fairing and the heat shield for engine 4 are removed, and we're waiting to get some additional information on that. Here's the near-term Artemis II outlook for the next 6 weeks or so, until the end of April. We saw the solar array wings installed on Orion early in the month, and the next major milestone is installation of the SAJ panels around the service module. In the MPPF, ICPS hydrazine servicing should be completed in the next few weeks. By the end of the month, we should see the core stage mated to the boosters in VAB High Bay 3. There's a lot of work to get there in the next few weeks to move the stage from High Bay 2 back to horizontal in the transfer aisle, and then back to vertical for the move up and over into High Bay 3. Then next month in April, we should see the near-term SLS stacking completed and Orion moved to the MPPF. After hydrazine servicing is complete and the core stage has moved out of the VAB transfer aisle to free up some room, ICPS will be moved in there from the MPPF. We'll see the LVSA stage connector lifted up and mated first, followed by the ICPS. The interim cryogenic propulsion stage should clear the MPPF before Orion moves there, and we'll be watching to see if Orion is ready to make that move by the end of next month. Once SLS is assembled on Mobile Launcher 1 and High Bay 3, preparations to begin integrated test and checkout will begin, and the traveled work on the core stage will resume. To remind everyone, there is a list of traveled work items that this 3-month or so stay in the High Bay 2 Core Stage Vertical Integration Center tool allowed NASA and Boeing to start working. After Core Stage 2 is lifted into High Bay 3 and mated to the SLS boosters, that traveled work will be choreographed with all the integrated test and checkout work that will need to be performed between now and the end of the summer. One of those traveled work items was to flash update the engine controller units for the 4 RS-25 core stage engines. L3 Harris is the prime contractor for the RS-25 engines, and Honeywell is the prime for the engine controllers. Last month I'd asked Boeing for a status update on that work, and here's what I got. Quote, "The 4 engine controllers are at the supplier completing the NOR flash reprogramming process. They will be returned to KSC this spring for reinstallation on their respective engines while the stage is in VAB High Bay 3, unquote. In addition to that work, there is still the possibility of more engine work, retest of some main propulsion system valves in the engine section, and any changes that are decided on for the ascent vibration issue during the Artemis I launch. In most places, NASA is still showing Artemis II targeting launch in April 2026, and we'll see where things ultimately end up. However, there has been talk for the last few months about a quote-unquote work-to date sooner than next April. We may have got a sneak preview of that in the agency's broadcast of the March 12th launch attempt for SpaceX Dragon Crew 10. NASA's voice of launch control, Daryl Nail, providing commentary for the countdown and launch with astronaut Jessica Meir, mentioned a February 2026 date near the top of the broadcast.
Went all the way out to the launch tower. There she is again, saying goodbye to the Crew 2 at the time, helping them with everything they needed. And then Meir served as the assistant to the chief astronaut for Commercial Crew, and then helped out with the Artemis II astronauts. This was most recently, and there you are, right in the left part of the screen, helping out the Artemis II crew as they got ready for a dress rehearsal for the Artemis II mission, which is planned in February of next year. You also,
as I've noted in many of the videos since mid-December, the team getting Artemis II ready to fly has been challenged to roll the vehicle out to the pad for launch by the end of this year, which would be in that same ballpark of time. The vehicle would roll out to the pad about a week and a half to 2 weeks before it would be ready to launch, so taken literally, a rollout at the end of December would put that hypothetical in the middle of January. February or earlier is definitely an optimistic date, but the question will be how realistic that is. By definition, a work-to date wouldn't include much of any schedule margin, so work will have to go smoothly for basically a whole calendar year. As a part of imagery taken around the media event at KSC last week, NASA Public Affairs took pictures of Artemis III and IV Orion hardware that Lockheed is assembling in the ONC building. In the set, there were pictures of the Artemis III Orion crew and service modules. The crew module is in the crew module station as seen in these 2 pictures. The service module is in the lift station as seen here. It has presumably completed proof pressure testing of the fluid tube welds between the European service module and the crew module adapter. We last saw the SM in the proof test cell back in mid-December. Both modules are still ahead of their initial power-on or IPO milestones, and I asked PAO for an update on when those were planned. The current forecast is for the crew module IPO this spring, with the initial power-up of the service module this summer. At some point, the lift station where the service module was recently pictured will be used to attach the nozzle to the base of the already installed OMS engine. And then the spacecraft adapter cone will be attached to the bottom of the ESM in the same location. Big picture, we're still waiting to see what President Trump and Elon Musk propose to fund in the fiscal year 2026 budget request. There are rumors of not just SLS cancellation, but that Trump and Musk plan to defund Artemis and pivot NASA and taxpayer funding to a purely commercial Mars program for Musk's SpaceX Starship system. When I say Artemis, I'm talking about NASA's Exploration Directorate, which has the big-ticket programs that the U.S. federal government is funding. The Commercial Lunar Payload Services Initiative is something else grouped under the Artemis brand, but that investment in commercial R&D is funded out of the Science Directorate, which itself is rumored to be facing a large budget cut. The Exploration Directorate funding has been at around $8 billion annually, and in particular, those programs that are run by the government, like Orion, SLS, EGS, and Gateway, are the ones rumored to be in jeopardy. The first news on the budget request could be what is called a skinny budget, with some top-line numbers and details. We might find out the fate of those programs within the request at that point, or we might have to wait for the full request with all the details. Regardless, that would be the start of a traditional government budget cycle. Given the unorthodox first couple of months of this administration, it remains to be seen how this budget cycle will play out. Congress typically has a significant say in U.S. human spaceflight policy. However, it also remains to be seen whether the newly elected House and Senate collectively will assert any power this time when it comes to these programs. So we'll wait to see the numbers from the administration in their request, and then we'll wait to see what the reaction is to that from Congress. While that hangs over everything, most of NASA's Exploration Directorate programs are working to fly the Artemis II mission as soon as they can. The mission was officially delayed from September of this year, 2025, to April 2026. As I noted a little earlier, NASA is trying to move that date up as much as maybe 2 months to February 2026, with a remaining challenge to try to roll the completed Artemis II vehicle out to the launch pad by the end of this year. Moving the launch date up 2 or 3 months will depend on more or less trouble-free launch processing for the next 6 months, and really more or less trouble-free launch processing from here until launch. To stay on track, Orion assembly and test needs to stay on the late April schedule for completion. Then, after moving to the MPPF, it will need to finish all the commodity loading in 3 months, so by the end of July, it will need to be headed to the Launch Abort System facility, and then by the end of September on the way to the VAB for stacking on top of SLS. EGS Integrated Operations may have a little more time to test and check out SLS after it is stacked next month, but there is still a good deal of work in the spring and summer to complete. For Artemis III, we see these pictures of that particular Orion spacecraft build in subassembly integration and test, and similarly for the Artemis III SLS core stage. Those are the 2 major pieces of that vehicle remaining to be completed. Now that the mission was delayed to no earlier than mid-2027, one of the questions is whether that change announced back in December has propagated back to contracted delivery dates. The mid-2027 date likely reflects the soonest that the Orion and SLS hardware could be ready to fly a mission following Artemis II. However, that does not take into account any post-flight changes or unplanned work that might be necessary above and beyond the programmatic turnaround from Artemis II to Artemis III. More significantly, though, that also likely doesn't take into account the readiness of the Axiom Space lunar surface spacewalk suits, or even more significantly, the readiness of the SpaceX Starship lunar lander variant. In the wake of back-to-back flight tests that were cut short before all the technology demos planned could be performed, the Starship HLS schedule is an even bigger question mark than it was before. Starship development will continue regardless of the political fate of Artemis, but orbital flight testing might not begin until much farther into 2025 now, and even before the second ship prototype in a row exploded, Elon Musk had already indicated that orbital refueling demonstrations weren't likely to happen until 2026. The schedules for Orion and SLS production are infrequently updated, but the schedules for the lunar lander and spacesuit are top secret. Speculation about an alternate mission using the Artemis III, Orion, and SLS hardware was preempted by the prospects that President Trump and Musk could terminate not just Artemis III, but all of Artemis. If it turns out that Artemis III is not canceled, not only will the questions continue about when we might see the critical path hardware completed and delivered, but also the questions about alternative missions could come back to life. But that depends on whether Artemis is still alive. Even if Trump and Musk slash and burn Artemis to ashes, questions about Starship delays and the broader Starship schedule and roadmap will continue, including whether Starships will be headed to Mars in the 2026 transfer window that opens in only about 18 months. As always, thanks for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative. And consider subscribing to find out what's going on with Artemis every week.